First of all, a twin screw extruder with 2 screws. It is in the whole extrusion process. I think it should be divided into the following stages. First of all, the first stage is the feeding. The main feed side of the feeding port to feed. After feeding to pass a stage called compression. Compression stage will find the feeding port is a large lead, followed by the middle lead, and then until the small lead. This is called the compression stage. The beginning of the compression stage of the process in the process of compression stage. The outside world has a heating rod or heating plate. There is an outside world to send a heat to it. So at this time the plastic cannot melt, but has basically reached softening. Softening will enter the first plasticizing shear. Plasticizing shear usually occurs in the third barrel of the barrel, or the second barrel of the second half of the beginning. If you count the upper and lower material mouths, it is certainly the third section after the beginning of plasticizing. Plasticizing, a basic principle, is also a transition from a small angle to a large angle. In this process of plasticization, each material compression after. In fact, it did not reach melting. This time is still in a relatively low material temperature. So my experience can tell you, in this plasticization stage you can properly roll a little more intensive a combination of shear block. For example, you can roll 5, 6 or even 7 at the same time. A whole string of a group, which does not need to insert any transport blocks on such a large string can be. Of course, there is a situation cannot do so. For example, you do flame retardant materials, and flame retardant is in the main feed together. Then it is not recommended to have 7 or even 8 so many a shear block string together. If not, this is possible, and with a relatively low temperature, better shear, so that it fast melting. This is a more desirable result. After plasticization will be to carry out the appropriate melt. We must give it a relaxation. There may be 1 to 2 of a transport block. That this time should be a small lead. Do not remove that pressure. After relaxation, and then the second shear. After shear, this time the material has actually belonged to a better plasticized the exhaust stage. As we all know, must be depressurized before the exhaust. The first section of the gap in the exhaust port to have a reverse thread, reverse transport block or reverse shear block, and then give it a certain resistance, followed by a large lead, rapid depressurization, and then make the material quickly through the exhaust port at this time. The exhaust port natural exhaust. You can get rid of the gas. That natural exhaust port is often the long glass fiber to join the port. After the end of compression. Compression after the shear. That is, if the glass fiber, regardless of the long fiber staple fiber, usually in the exhaust port or after the exhaust port to join the second shear dispersion. My personal experience, I recommend that you cannot have a too concentrated a shear arrangement. Usually I think 2 groups, up to 3 groups on it. Whether you are 6 or 7 or 4, then I usually think 2 to 3 for a group. Then the second shear. After the shear to the second exhaust stage. That time the general exhaust is with a certain negative pressure. The so-called vacuum port vacuum exhaust. The vacuum port vacuum exhaust and the first exhaust port of a combination of principles is the same. This time there is still a certain reverse threaded block to lower the pressure. And finally in the force, the rapid decline to produce an exhaust the effect. The last stage is that we will use a small guide, and then a whole series of small guide conveying blocks to compress the material, and then to ensure that at a constant speed, it can have a good extrusion pressure, to give a stable pressure to the die, and then to achieve an extrusion pulling strip or underwater or shear, can get a particle size of a more uniform. This is the entire twin screw process. And I think a screw combination of a principle of arrangement. For your reference,